Tom, that's fascinating about the negative planet. Were you able to estimate how long it took them to turn around?
Well, probably not. You know, when I first got there, it was a very negative place. Everything was very negative. There were little bits and pieces that were not, but they were just barely hanging on. When I went back I don't know, 15, 20 years later of my time, um, I noticed that the positive had grown a lot. There was a significant amount of improvement. But then this was so bad that any little improvement would have been, amazing. So yes, and that was only about 15 years worth, 15, 20 years. So it was within a generation. There was a change within a generation. Everybody was unhappy. Everybody was miserable. Everybody was full of fear. It was just a very unpleasant place. Much, much, much more unpleasant than we are here. Much more negative than our virtual reality. So even if we do spin out of control and blow all ourselves up with nuclear weapons to where there isn't any humans left on the planet, well, evolution will just keep on trudging along, and it may be another 100,000 years after that, and we'll start again. That's just the way it is. So in the biggest picture, love always wins, but it doesn't necessarily win quickly.
Thanks, Tom. Well, we're on to Boris next. He's very excited about the prospects of the World
Oh,
Cup, but he also has a question for you. Allez les Bleus. Eh?
yes. Hey, Tom. Good to be with you. So I had a question about faith. I made a research and I can see you don't speak that often about it. So I've worked a lot on my intuitive side those last months, years, and working actively with the SES, or what I call my higher self. And lately I'm getting a lot of guidance and a lot of pressure, I would say, to become a master at uncertainty, which you talk a lot about, but also about building faith. So I would love to hear from you about how you would define faith and how we could, I would say, grow into it.
I'm not a big proponent of faith, and that's because I would rather know than have faith.
Mm.
Faith is a belief. I have faith that it's going to be this way, or faith that it'll work out this way. That means you believe that it'll work out that way. You think it'll work out that way. And the word faith to me is often just a strong belief. Now, so, we're dealing with words here, right? And unfortunately for you, we're dealing with words in English. It would be better if I could speak your language, so it would probably be easier for you. But so let's also talk about the word hope. Now, hope is a positive thing. We have hope that things will get better. And we could say we have faith that things will get better. Again, we're mostly talking about a belief. If you are not a very grown up person, then faith and belief probably play a much bigger part in your life, because you really don't understand big picture very well. Okay, so in that case, you will find that in people who don't understand the picture very well, faith and hope are very important. If they don't have hope, then they lose faith. But if you look at it, you know, from a perspective of low entropy, then you would say that you just accept things the way they are. Sort of like this discussion that we just had. things are the way they are, and they may be negative, they may even be horrible, but that's just the way they are. And we can't control other people, how they feel or what they do. We can only control ourselves. So then the alternative to faith or the alternative to belief is just to know or to be able to accept things with uncertainty. Okay. I would like things to get better sooner rather than later, but I wouldn't say that I have hope or that I have faith. But I think it's possible, and I think we can do it. Maybe in the shorter term rather than the longer term. You know, it's a couple of decades rather than a couple of millennia. But that's not hope. To me, that's just the possibilities. Looking at the probabilities, looking at the history, looking at the changes, and saying, well, I think there's a 30% probability that we can take some bigger steps in the next 3 decades. So that's just an assessment. It's just the way we use words often. Often, the way I use the words, somebody else may feel the same way I do, but just use different words. They may say, well, I have hope that things are going to get better in the next couple of decades. And I have faith that they will. And I would say, well, I think they will because, that's what the information I have would say that it's a possibility. And I think the possibility is pretty fair. I can see how it might happen. So I tend to look at everything in terms of probability and possibility instead of in terms of hope and faith. But often it's just a matter of language. It may be a very small difference in between the way I feel and the way somebody else feels, and I use one set of words and they use another set of words. It just depends on the individual, I guess, and the words they use aren't really all that important. So that's just my take on those words. Words like hope and words like faith, they tend to come, in my mind, out of belief, out of the ego, and they make us feel better because we have hope, we have faith that something good is going to happen or something will be better. To me, I find that less satisfactory than just saying that I think things will get better because I see the trends. I see where it's going and I see how it can work. So I don't have hope. I just have I see the possibility and I think the probability is finite. It's pretty good. So that's just different. So you have to kind of look at the words and not get too tied up in the words themselves. Better to focus on the concept and not the words. You can use the words hope and faith and basically have the same attitude that I do.
Yeah.
But you just use those other words.
Yeah.
So faith is about belief.
Yeah.
Hope is too.
Like the way I experience it right now is a lot about conviction and trust. It's like being tested around my trust, about basically I'm facing a lot of uncertainty and a lot of stuff that could be irrational for the mind. And basically I experience it as, you've got all the experiences to prove about this higher reality. And can you trust us? Not can you trust us, but can you trust yourself and can you trust the path and can you trust your intent?
The way to approach that, Boris, is that there's a lot of things you'll never know for sure.
Yeah.
Looking for ones and zeros in probability is mostly futile.
Yeah.
It's not there, well, I can discard this, it's a zero, or this is true, it's a one. Very few things in life are like that. Mostly they're somewhere in between the one and the zero. And you can look at things and feel like, they're likely or they're unlikely, or they're likely to take place, but not for a long, long time, or they're likely to take place and could, be in a shorter time. And these are all just your own assessments from the information you get, from the facts that you can find. You look at all the facts and you come up with a kind of an assessment. But you'll never know whether that assessment is right. You won't know because you may not have all the facts. Matter of fact, you can probably guarantee that you don't have all the facts. There are things that things that you don't know. And therefore, you have to always remain open-minded that, that what you think might be true maybe isn't. But you look at your experience. And again, if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. So you have experiences. You want to find out, then you explore areas on your own, get some experience, and then come up with some possibilities. I think this is possible. And I think it's even likely. May not be true, but I think it's possible and likely. And I'll just go with that. So I'll put effort into it until I get new information that tells me that it's less likely. And then I'll have I'll put that down instead of a 90%, I'll put it down to a 30% because I got new information. So that's the point of saying that you need to stay open-minded and skeptical of everything. Don't look for certainties. Don't look for absolutes. Because in the most case, those certainties and absolutes are mostly just beliefs.
Yeah.
Because we just don't know. We don't have enough information. There aren't enough facts for us to say for sure about how anything is, even about how we are ourselves. There's just very little that is a 1 and a 0. And if things are 1 and 0s, it's usually because they're so very, very simple, real simple little things. But big things like, evolving and lowering entropy and the nature of reality and all these things that are really complex, there are no certainties in it. There's only possibilities and probabilities. And then things like faith and hope really don't, those words don't really mean much because they're looking at speculation, I guess. I'd rather say, instead of saying hope, I think this will happen, instead of I hope that it does. And here's why. But I only give that a 75% probability or a 20% probability because I don't know. There's so many unknowns. I don't know. So living gracefully with uncertainty is a better way to live your life rather than searching for absolutes and then believing in them.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Diego. Diego, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, Tom. Hey, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you just fine.
Okay. My question is relating to helping other people, specifically helping people in our lives who have anxiety. And I just was wondering if you had any wisdom on supporting people when they're having like a panic attack or just an anxiety episode, and how not to let that anxiety like absorb it into myself too at the same time.
Okay, let me start by saying what not to do. And that is, if there's somebody having an anxiety attack, trying to intellectually talk to them about, well, that's not such a, that's not so scary. That's not such a, you shouldn't be anxious about that. That doesn't work. To try to tell them that they need to be different or should be different is not part of the solution. That will just create, negativity between the two people. So when somebody's having an anxiety attack, that's a fear attack. They have fears, and the fears will immobilize them. What you can do is just be a comfort. There's no intellectual solution to that. It's not an intellectual problem. So trying to analyze it and then explaining to them why their anxiety is misplaced, why they shouldn't be anxious about that. That generally does not help. If you just sit with them, be with them, say things that are positive. Don't try to analyze it. Don't try to solve it. Just be positive and be there. It's probably as much as you can do. They just need some, a hand to hold, perhaps, or somebody who will be with them and not criticize them or tell them that they're silly for having the anxiety. That just gives them more anxiety. So that would be the suggestion. If it's a friend or someone that you're close to that has anxiety attacks, just be with them. And then when the attack is gone, now you may be able to help them discover the fear. Where's the basic fear? And then help them work on that fear. There's a basic fear there someplace. It's creating the anxiety. And maybe you could be of help. Just, discussing possibilities. I wouldn't do analysis and say, here's your problem, here's a fear, and you need to get over that. Again, that's giving them a solution, but giving people solutions isn't helpful usually. So you can say, well, is the basic fear that's driving this. Now, this is not while they're having the attack, it's after it's gone, and they're more rational. And then you say, and here are some possibilities. It could be A, B, C, D, or E. Might be the cause of it. I don't know. You'll have to, go inside yourself and see if any of those ring true, if you want to. And then just go on to some other topic. Don't push on it, because if you push on it, you'll create more anxiety. So that would be the way. If you can help them deal with the fear that's driving it, great. But you got to do that very gently and very slowly, because somebody who's prone to anxiety generally doesn't deal well with criticism. So it has to not come across as criticism or as you fixing them. It just offer possibilities and then let them look at it, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just ignore it. Then there's not too much you can do. Maybe you can help them avoid the triggers that trigger their anxiety. Do a little search for the triggers with them when they're not having an anxiety attack. What are the things that trigger it? Because that'll give you a good idea what the fear is. And maybe discuss those. And if you can, try to avoid those things. Those triggers, stay away from them. If you see one coming along, or that's a trigger, try to intercept that trigger before it sets off an anxiety attack. So those are basically the things you can do. But direct intervention is usually a negative, not a positive.
Thanks, Tom. And the second part of that question could relate to anxiety or anything really, but how can I keep myself from getting anxious in those situations? Because when my partner's having an anxiety attack, sometimes it's I start to feel very anxious myself. What should I do? Should I get a heated blanket? Should I get some tea? I'm rushing around, like you said, trying to intellectually think about the problem and solving it. But
generally that doesn't help. It probably tends to make things worse. So if you become anxious because they're anxious, then your anxiety will drive, her anxiety, and it just is going to make everything worse. What you need to do is just realize that somebody you care about is having a problem, and you just want to be with them and give them support as they work through that problem. They have to work through it. There's just not much you can do. You could ask them, would you like a cup of hot tea? Do you need a blanket? Are you getting chills? You could maybe ask them a couple of questions, but don't pepper them with questions, because then you make a nuisance of yourself. then you're actually saying, I see there's something wrong with you and I want to help. And then that will make their anxiety even worse. So everything you do has to be gentle and caring. So don't let it give you anxiety too. It's their thing, not your thing. And you just want to be as much a part of the solution for them as possible and not add to their anxiety. So if you're starting to feel anxious because you don't know what to do, here's a person and they're coming unglued and you have no idea what to do about it, then to do about it is maybe nothing. Just sit down, hold their hand. Or just sit down and be quiet. Just be with them. Depends on the nature of their anxiety. Some just having somebody around that cares for you, just to be there, is probably very important. Being by yourself and having an anxiety attack is probably worse. So, saying, well, I'll just leave and I'll come back later when you feel better, probably isn't very helpful. But trying to solve the problem isn't very helpful either. Just be there. And sometimes there's nothing for you to do. But realize that just being there is probably important. Even though you feel like you're doing nothing, that's probably the most important thing that you could do. Just be there and be positive. If their anxiety is one of that's turned against themselves, some self-negativity, then while you're just being there, you could maybe tell them that you love them or that you care about them or that you're going to be okay, or this too shall pass, or whatever else. Just be comforting in that way. That might help. But you'll have to do a trial and error. If you try something and it makes it worse, then you'll know not to try it again. It just depends on the person and what's driving them. Does that help you, Diego?
Yeah. Thanks, Sam.
Dee, if you'd like to go ahead with your question. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. And hello, everyone, and Tom. And thank you, Diego, for bringing up this very important topic. I actually had almost the same questions like you. So let's see if I have some follow-ups on this. And one thing that I have been thinking about when it comes to anxiety attacks is actually, what can a person do physically with their avatar in order to be more stable? I mean, how important do you think, Tom, that it is with regular food, exercise, sleep, and all these things? How do they fit into these patterns of anxiety?
Well, if you have anxiety, a person has anxiety, it's because of a fear. It's because something isn't right in their mind. Something isn't the way it should be. And usually it's them. They're not the way they think they should be. Often it's a negative self-referential thing, not feeling very positive about themselves, not feeling competent, not feeling like they're in charge or whatever, feeling helpless and unable to cope. Okay, so yes, if that person were to exercise and being involved in things and connected to things, the more they can connect to life in general and other people, the better it'll be for them. They will have less and less anxiety. Most of the fear and the anxiety is something created within their own mind. It's not that there's a real, monster out there someplace that causes them anxiety. The monster is self-created in their mind. It's their own attitude, usually toward themselves, a negative attitude toward them. So the more they could get involved in life, connected with friends, connect with other people, have a social life, the more successes that they have, then the more confidence they will gain and the less their anxiety will be. So sure, a positive interactive life is a real good antidote to anxiety, because that kind of a life builds confidence. But somebody that's anxiety prone, you can't just shove them into a social situation because it'll probably trigger the anxiety attack. You're going to have to introduce those things very slowly and gently, in a way that you pick a situation where they interact or exercise or do whatever they do, where it's likely to be positive, and then expand on that and make it a little broader in scope, but make sure it stays positive. And eventually you'll maybe have them doing things, just a walk in the park, or whatever. I don't know. Sports are good. Playing an instrument, musical instrument's good. Anything that takes their focus away from themselves and their own inadequacy would be good. But you have to be careful with that, because if you throw them in the deep end to see if they'll swim, they'll usually sink, because they already are prone to the anxiety. So it has to be a gradual developing their positive image about themselves. Create
Yeah.
success.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds really helpful, I think. Very good. And I do have another follow-up on this topic, and that is also when a person has an active anxiety attack. One fear that come up then could be actually that, will this stick? Will I stay in this state? And what if it stays and I never get out of it? And I have, based on my experience, I know that emotions, they come and go, but that is not helpful to say to a person in this situation. They would like to have facts. I know statistically that you will get out of it. I don't know what to say to a person to help when they have that fear that it will stick. I will never get out of this anxiety attack.
Yeah. Well, usually the thing that is the reboot is going to sleep. That kind of reboots the system. Go to sleep and wake up in the morning and everything will be better. So that's typically a fact. That works most of the time. People having an anxiety attack generally don't get them as they wake up. It's as they start thinking about things, and their inadequacy is what starts the anxiety. So I don't know. Maybe if it's in the morning, then going to sleep maybe isn't so palatable, because go take a nap. That's not palatable for some people. But if they're like that all day long, then make sure that when they get up, we distract them with something else. Oh, this morning I've decided we're going to go out to Chi-Chi's and have a big breakfast or something. Just distractions right away in the morning. Start a different subject or whatever, and so they don't go right back into that same thing. But that's the main thing for people to reboot is sleep. Sometimes people will learn to reboot with meditation. If they practice meditation, they'll find that they can kind of reboot their emotions and their feelings just by meditating. Maybe for an hour, sit down and just, that's calming enough that it stops it. So that would be another kind of reboot to bump you out of the state that you're in. But that would take a lot of practice. A person would have to practice their meditation probably for some months, if not some years, before they could use that to get them out of an anxiety attack. The thing not to do is to act like you're really worried and you're walking on eggshells, and you're looking at them, because there's something wrong with them and they're having a problem, and you don't want to trigger it. Right away they can feel that, and what that says to them is that they're dysfunctional. There's a problem. Yeah. And they're causing other people problems, which then gives them something else that's negative toward themselves. So you can't hover, and you can't just kind of stare at them hoping they'll get better. All of that indicates that they are a problem and they have a problem, which usually makes the problem worse. So you just have to treat them like as normal as possible, not like a fragile somebody that's liable to go off.
Is it important that they? I'm thinking that because it gets so easy that a person who feels like this get into a mood of not taking responsibility. Is it good to sort of nudge them into more responsibilities?
Well, if that nudging is done very carefully, sure, nudging might help. But if that nudging is done from a kind of a pushy viewpoint, here, you need to do this and be responsible for it, it probably won't help. It'll probably make it worse. So the nudging would have to be more of something that is natural, that develops naturally, because otherwise they know that you're trying to fix them. And here's your solution. And they need to do such and such. They need to get involved with that. And you tell them, but then you are reinforcing their dysfunction. So you have to be subtle about how you interact with people who are having anxiety attacks. Because if you tiptoe around them and are afraid to talk to them because you're afraid to set it off, that is likely to set it off, because that's acting in a way that makes them feel, negative toward themselves. So often just be normal, be every day, be the way it is. And rather than say, well, I think if you had some responsibility, that would help, that just sets the situation up for failure. But here, could you do this for me? I really would appreciate it. Now they could do that just to be helpful, and that may turn into a responsibility. But you see, it's subtle. It's not pointing out that they have a problem.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you. There is so much to learn from both ends in these situations.
The error we tend to make is that we think there is an intellectual solution to every problem, and anxiety attack is not an intellectual, problem. It's an emotional. It's a problem with self, but it's not intellectual. Nobody sits down and says, well, I'm going to have an anxiety attack now. It's not, it just happens. It's what's the right word for it? It's non-rational. So you cannot apply a rational solution to a non-rational problem. When you try to apply a rational solution, then typically you make the irrational problem get worse. Typically. So realize that it is irrational, and that's okay. Most of us are irrational most of the time. We're not nearly as logical beings as we think we are. So just be subtle, not intellectual in your approach.
Tom, if I may, I've been having a little bit of an anxiety attack myself the past few weeks. when I'm thinking about the larger consciousness system and kind of getting that deep understanding of that's really what we are. We are a part of this system. It is us. And I start to take those logical conclusions of, well, where did it come from, right? Where did this consciousness arise from? And that's one of those assumptions that makes up your model. Consciousness exists, right? And it's one of those unknowable things where it's like the gut bacteria trying to conceptualize the seasons and the harvests and how it gets its food. And I'm just a little gut bacteria. And I'm starting to get a little anxiety now that I kind of understand, well, what I am and, well, where did I come from, right? Where did this LCS arise from? Maybe you could help me with a perspective on that.
Okay, well, as you said, there is no certain answer to that. But there is some speculation. And partly there is no certain answer on that because we are part of the system. We can't see outside the system. You know, being a part of the system, we cannot watch the birth of the system of which we are a part because we don't exist until after that birth takes place. So it's a logical impossibility that you'll ever know for certain. But there is some speculation. And the speculation basically takes two things and pulls them together. One is spontaneous actualization of potential. And that's called emergent complexity theory. What that says, if you have potential, that eventually, if you wait long enough, that potential will create something. Now, that something may just disappear back into potential again, but that something may be stable and then may grow, and something stable may come out of that. So that's one idea, just that if you have potential, something will develop out of that potential. And the other one is cellular automata, which is basically a little simple, well, they're really process fractals, what they are, but you have a little process. And if you Google game of life, I'm trying to think of the name that goes with that.
John Conway.
Yeah, John Conway, game of life. You'll see he just starts like with a checkerboard. Make a little rule that say, all the red checkers that are next to a black checker turn black, and all the black checkers next to a red checker turn red. And then he does the math and makes those changes. And once he makes those changes, of course, the board looks totally different. Now he makes that change again. Okay, now everything's different. So now change. And he's found out that's a cellular automata. So there's a cells of being, if you like, and there's little rule sets that keep iteratively being applied. So you apply the same rule set again and again and again to the result. Every time you apply it, you get a different result. Then you apply it again. And they found that some of these cellular automata can have memory. They can send data other places, flyers they call them. They can actually emulate a general purpose computer. They have logic, AND gates, OR gates, that sort of thing, logic. So they have all the DNA, if you will, of a general purpose computer. But they start out very simple. So you take these two ideas, the spontaneous actualization of a potential. If you have possibilities, those possibilities will sometimes just produce something stable. And if all you have to produce is a little rule set, like turn all the red checkers black if they're next to all the red checkers black if they're next to a black. So that's a rule set. If you have those two both working together, you can then make a hand-waving argument. That's how consciousness developed. Now, if you look at the the ancient Vedic description of source, of where it all came from, they'll basically say it began with the void. But the void was not just emptiness, it was no thing, but it had potential. And then the void quickened, and that potential produced something, and that something began to evolve. So that's kind of what the Vedic says. This turns out to be something similar. You say it would agree with that ancient tradition, in that what's being produced is just a little rule set that then applies to itself over and over, and then it evolves. And it evolves, I don't know, just because it does. Yeah, we can't really put a reason of what's doing it. Now, of course, the question is, where did that potential come from? You see, you have to start with the potential. Where did that potential come from? I just don't know. You know, you always get to something that you just don't know because we can't know. So that's about as best I can do for you, Adam, is that there are possibilities. Now, if you go to, I think it was Stanford University, go to their philosophy department, look up cellular automata. They will have about a 10 or 15, 20-page dissertation on how those two things may have created consciousness. But it's basically kind of what I told you is the very short answer. But it still doesn't tell you where that potential came from. You're always going to end up with something that is unknown, because that's philosophically necessary, because we can't know everything about a process of which we are part of. We can't know about its beginning. So you're stuck there.
I get it. I'm stuck right there. You just can't know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look up that cellular automata from Stanford. I'm gonna give that a look. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that'll give you a good hand waving argument for how that might come about. But it's conjecture. And there isn't anything that you'll ever have about origins that is better than conjecture. That's logic says it's going to have to be conjecture. So I guess the thing is to realize that that's the way it is, and just not be concerned or worry about, beginnings. Something began because here we are. Consciousness exists because, here it is, we're conscious. That's where I started my book, because I didn't want to get into the conjecture. I just brought it in as an assumption.
Adam, that link is in the chat. And for explanation on what Tom was just talking about, check out Agrippa's trilemma, or also called the Munchausen's trilemma, about how those kinds of things end in circular reasoning or some sort of axiomatic, God did it, or there's three of them. It's interesting reading.
Yeah, of course, the thing that people get hung up on is the infinite regress. If everything has a cause, then there's an infinite number of causes, right? Because this has a cause. Now, what's the cause of that cause? Well, it has to have a cause. And then that cause of the cause has to have a cause. And then the cause of the cause of the cause, and so on. And you end up with an infinite regression of causes. Okay, and that's illogical. Obviously, an infinite regression of causes isn't the proper answer. The proper answer is we don't know. And that's not a fault. We can't know. So infinite regression is also not a rational answer.
All right, thank you, Donna. You think we have time for one more?
Well, Tom, we went over a little bit. We got started a little late. We have two more people, Priscilla and Linda and Mike on. It's up to you if you'd like to carry
Oh,
it on.
let's go.
All right.
As long as I can talk and not cough, then I'm willing to
Um,
hang in here.
all right, we'll see how it goes. Priscilla, go
Yeah.
ahead.
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question. So, Tom, what would you say to people that find themselves trapped into situations in life due to things that they saw in their childhood and interpret as being the truth? For example, I find myself being afraid of romantic relationship, and I see myself consciously avoiding it. I grew up observing my dear mom doing her best to provide to her family. And that included working more than 9 hours per day, spending her little time that she had with her kids, and also trying to be a wife too. Unfortunately, my mom didn't have that much of support back from my father. Therefore, as a result, the belief that a romantic relationship is too much on people, specifically on women, became reality for me. There are several videos on your YouTube channel which talk about romantic relationship as per the MBT model. They have been extremely helpful for me. Thank you very much for that. Fortunately, I am aware of that belief/fear, but I also feel the resistance at some level that I don't want to get rid of that. I just can't get rid of that fear through the power of my intention. So being aware of that fear and continue intending to get rid of that fear is the way out of that, even though I am aware that there's some level of resistance in myself. So my question is, how would people get rid of belief or trapped situations in life where they interpret things from their childhood as being true? And therefore, even though I am aware of that, and I know that that is a fear or a belief, but at some level, I feel that I'm resistant to get rid of that fear.
Okay. The fears can be very difficult to get rid of, as you have found out. I mean, after all, it's something that you fear, and it's something that you believe. You came to a conclusion when you were very small. That conclusion now is embedded in you as being truth, as being a fact. And for you to walk away from that fact and not see it that way is very difficult. You try, but that just comes back and you come back to that same attitude over and over again. And I'm guessing that you find that attitude is dysfunctional. You'd like to get rid of that attitude. It's not functional. And I would agree with that. It is not functional. You know, people who feel insecure, people who feel inadequate, mostly came from them being 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 years old. A lot of our fears come out of that childhood when we don't really understand what's going on. But like most humans, we don't let that bother us. We make up a rule. We have a belief. And once we believe it, we stick with it because people don't see that they have beliefs. They think their beliefs are facts. That is just the way it is. And if you don't pay attention to that fact, then you're going to get hurt. There's going to be a problem. So then it's kind of part of your self-preservation that you hang on to that fact, that truth you got when you were, much younger. And I'd say probably 80% of all the fears that people struggle with are exactly like yours. They come out of being a very young child, probably 5 years and younger is where most of that comes from. And mostly they are false. They're not really true. They're one of those things that could be true, but not necessarily true. It could be that way, but it doesn't have to be that way. And they come from the fact that a child has a very simplistic view of reality. For them, things are pretty much black and white. They don't see nuance. They don't see all the reasons behind the reasons behind the reasons. They don't have all that depth of understanding. They just see something. They see that it's not working right or that it's a problem for them. They come up with a belief, and that belief sticks with them. Most people's problems come out of their early childhood. Problems like feeling inadequate, feeling not good enough. They had parents that were just too busy to give them the attention that they needed, and they took that to mean that they weren't good enough. They were inadequate. Well, of course, that's wrong. It just takes two people to make enough money, to live in a nice place in a nice neighborhood and wear, satisfactory clothes. And those were the first priorities of the parents. It doesn't mean that the parents didn't like them or didn't love them or didn't think they were adequate. So it's a child's view, which is usually very simplistic and not right. It's not really the way it was. It's just the way you look at it. So the question is, how do you get rid of it? You get rid of it with courage. If you get into a situation where that belief is starting to hurt, it's starting to make choices for you. You see things happening and immediately it falls into that pattern. Oh, I see what that is. Yeah. That's not good. I'm not going there. And now it creates problems in your life. You need to have the courage to say, well, maybe this isn't like that. Maybe what I think is not an immutable fact that every relationship has to be that way. Maybe it was just the way it seemed to me when I was 3 years old, or 4 or 5 or 6. And have the courage to say, well, I'm going to try to let it be some other way. I'm going to give it the space it needs to grow into some other way. And you can share that fear with your partner or with whoever else is triggering these issues. You can say, I grew up in a house like this and I have this belief, this fear, and it gets triggered. And here are the things that trigger it. And then suddenly my mind goes into some other, irrational space where I know this is a horrible thing. And I start reacting to it when maybe it's not really a horrible thing at all. So courage, give it a try and see if this wouldn't be different. See if it doesn't have more texture, more character, more things going on with it than just a simple thing you saw as a child. So I'd say that's probably the way you should start, because you wouldn't be bringing it up if the belief wasn't causing you a problem. The belief is causing you a problem. You immediately jump to conclusions that probably aren't true based on that belief. And I think that being brave enough to just go anyway, even though your little girl, that little girl in your head is saying, no, 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 this is horrible. This isn't going to work. I've seen it before. Just say, well, maybe. We'll see. And go try something else and try, to be aware of how that little girl's vision was only a vision, like I say, of a 3-year-old. They really didn't understand the context. So it's very likely not correct. Now, parts of it may be correct, but you're turning it into something, you're making everything fit that form. It's like you've got this form and everything, all of your relationships, you see that form and you react out of the belief. which is not a good idea. So be skeptical even of yourself, that you may have seen it wrong. It may not be that simple. And there may be things that look like that terrible thing you remembered when you were a child, but it may actually be different when you look at all the contexts and other things going on with it. Courage is really the best antidote for fear. I don't know of anything else really to tell you. You can just have an intention to get rid of it, but evidently that hasn't worked very well. So what you're left with is just courage. Just courage. Say, all right, I don't want this old fear to ruin, relationships, ruin, future relationships. All right, I had it when I was 3 years old, but it's coming back and being dysfunctional now. Just screw up your courage and step out and be aware, but don't jump to any conclusions. Stay skeptical. See what happens. And particularly if the person that you're having this issue with, particularly if they understand it. If they understand where you're coming from and why you feel that way, that would be very helpful, because then they can work with you and they won't get upset or annoyed because, you have this attitude. They'll realize where it's coming from and that you're trying to get over it, and that way they can work with you. So it'd be better to share that.
Great, thank you so much. I'm taking that word to the heart, courage. Thank you so much.
Tom, we have one more quick question from Linda. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is just sort of maybe an intellectual one about, I see as an older person, I see that social media and the internet have evolved very rapidly and sort of taken over people's, in particular, social media consciousness in a way, and it's a place where people meet, and to some extent, their consciousness lives there. I mean, our children are kind of like that. I mean, everything they do in PMR, they have to film and stuff so they can put it on social media. And so my question is this a sign of progress for humanity? I mean, or is it more like some people are regressing into the primordial chat room?
I'd say that it's probably both. It is a sign of progress in the sense that we're developing communications where a large number of people on the planet are plugged into. We can have conversations now that could never happen before, and this ability to do that is a very good thing. There's lots of information that's on that internet that you can access. Of course, there's a lot of trash on that internet as well that you can get to. So there's going to be, whenever you have a new technology that basically changes the way people think and the way people live, you're going to have some good news and some bad news goes with that. You're going to have some things that give you new opportunities, wonderful opportunities, and you're going to have some things that are problems. So it's both. It comes with its problems, and we've seen that. A lot of the problems we have socially now are because of the internet. So it comes with problems, but we have to learn. We have to learn, and think of the past big revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution. See, that was a big deal back in the early 1800s. And there was abuses. There's still abuses, in that. But it's also done a lot of good. It's created a lot of better situations, easier lives. We don't have to go down to the stream and pound our clothes with rocks. We can throw them in a washing machine. We can talk to people on our cell phone. All the technologies have upsides and downsides. the internet has a very strong side, and I think in the long run, it will turn out to be a very good and positive thing. So yes, that's a success. But in the meantime, we're going to have to learn how to deal with the negatives. We're going to have to learn how to kind of self-regulate as well as actually regulate some of the internet businesses. Some of them are preying on people, just like the early industrial revolution. You always get the horror stories of the 10-year-old kid who was chained to his machine so he wouldn't run off and not come back in the morning. We have horror stories about the industrial revolution and how it treated people. And people worked 6 and 7 days a week, and they worked 10 and 15-hour days, and they were paid not quite enough to survive on, just enough that they could keep working. So we have those things, and we don't have those problems anymore. We still have problems, but they're not that bad. We've overcome a lot. So it's the same thing. Now we're in the information age, not the industrial age, and we've just begun it. So we're still in the kind of the wild front end of it, where it's being abused as well as used. And slowly, we as a culture and as a people will learn to deal with those negatives. I think right now we're just finding out what the negatives are. I don't think we've really begun to deal with them very, very well yet, but we will. So in the big picture, internet's going to be a great benefit. In the short-term picture, watch out. There's some abuse and dangers involved, and the only way we'll get through those, again, it's the management by crisis. Crisis will happen. People will be hurt. People will be built. People will get on the internet and be scammed, and we'll have things like that going on. And we'll just have to learn what that scam looks like and how to avoid it. And maybe eventually there'll be software such that scams will be taken off the internet, detected. So both. There is risk involved. You kind of have to hope kids these days will do, we'll see those problems, shy away from them, learn from them. If they get hurt, they'll have to go back and be a little smarter next time. It's a mixed bag, just like any big new thing. It changes everybody's life and the way people think. It's going to be, we can't even guess what life will be like, what, even 20 years from now, much less, what was the Industrial Revolution is now, 200 years or so. And we still have problems with that Industrial Revolution. It still bites sometimes, but we will eventually overcome all that. So you just hope for the best. Give good advice to your kids. They'll make their own decisions, live their own lives, and they'll have to learn from the bumps, just like we did when we were growing up. We had to learn from the bumps in the road.
It creates a different kind of mindset in my mind. Like
does.
They're always in 2 or 3 places at once, which I guess when you're young, that's easy. But I feel like the PMR is so amazing already that it's not getting the attention it deserves.
That's true. That'll probably be one of the downsides.
Yeah.
Is that life will become so superficial. Because these internet connections are pretty superficial for the most part, even if the people involved, feel otherwise. They generally are fairly superficial, and we may find that
chat room, right?
Yeah. So it may be that that's one of the issues. Life will become so superficial in relationships and other things because the internet makes it like that. It's kind of anonymous. It doesn't have a lot of depth to it. But people will have to deal with that and find ways around it. I think in the long run, it's a really wonderful technology that'll be terrific. But it's not all upside. There's some downsides to it with everything else.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us for this 87th Fireside Chat. It's been a remarkable session. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to produce free content. It is our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.